The Pentagon says it costs $185 billion. The CBO says it could cost $1.2 trillion. That $1 trillion gap is a ghost in the American economy, and it is headed straight for your wallet. Not as a bill with your name on it, not as a tax line called Golden Dome, but as borrowing, interest, future tax pressure, and fewer budget choices. That is the real money question behind President Donald Trump's Golden Dome. When President Trump orders an Iron Dome-style missile shield for America, and the Pentagon talks about a $185 billion program, but the Congressional Budget Office says a similar national missile defense system could cost about $1.2 trillion over 20 years. Who actually pays the difference? At first, the answer sounds obvious. The U.S. federal government pays, but the federal government has taxes, borrowing, and the power to move today's cost into tomorrow's budget. That is where Trump's Golden Dome stops being only a defense story. It becomes a money flow story. President Trump's Iron Dome for America order becomes a Pentagon plan. That plan becomes budget requests, approval from U.S. lawmakers, defense contracts, federal spending, taxes, borrowing, and interest. The simple story is clean. Trump announces a shield, the Pentagon designs it, contractors build it, Congress funds it, and America gets protection. But mega projects do not work like one-time purchases. The first payment buys the system. The later payments keep the system alive. That is why the gap between $185 billion and a $1.2 trillion matters. Reuters reported that the CBO estimate of about $1.2 trillion dwarfs the $185 billion price tag offered by the program's Pentagon director. That is not just a bigger number, it is a different way of counting the bill. CBO said its national missile defense system would cost about $1.2 trillion to develop, deploy, and operate for 20 years. Acquisition costs alone would be just over $1 trillion. The most expensive part is the space-based interceptor layer. CBO said that layer makes up about 70% of acquisition costs and about 60% of total costs. Pause there. A dome sounds like one object, but financially Trump's Golden Dome is a stack of price tags. Ground interceptors add one layer, sensors add another, communications add another, battle management software adds another. Then the space-based interceptor layer makes the price tag explode. So the invoice is not build the dome. It is build a permanent defense ecosystem. Now here's the uncomfortable part. The U.S. is not starting this decision with a clean balance sheet. As of May 14, 2026, the U.S. owed about $38.95 trillion in total federal debt. About $31.28 trillion was debt held by the EU public. Money owed to outside investors, institutions, foreign holders, and the Federal Reserve. Roughly $7.68 trillion was debt the government owed to its own accounts, such as federal trust funds. So when President Trump's Golden Dome carries a possible trillion-dollar lifetime bill, the question is not only can America build it? The question is, what happens when another long-term promise is added to an already debt-heavy system? CBO projects the 2046 federal deficit at $1.9 trillion. That means spending is already expected to exceed revenue by almost $2 trillion in 1 year. CBO also projects debt held by the public rising from 101% of GDP in 2026 to 120% by 2036. That is where taxpayer pressure enters the story. No family receives a bill labeled Golden Dome tax. The pressure usually arrives through a slower route. If taxes do not rise today, Treasury borrows. If Treasury borrows, debt grows. If debt grows, interest takes the first bite. And if interest takes the first bite, future lawmakers have fewer choices before they even start debating schools, healthcare, defense, or taxes. CBO projects net interest costs rising from 3.3% of GDP in 2026 to 4.6% in 2036. A House Budget Committee summary of CBO's baseline says interest spending exceeds defense spending every year in the outlook and is almost double defense spending by 2036. That is the holy crap moment. Interest does not defend the country. It does not build a bridge. It does not buy a missile. It pays for past borrowing. So if Trump's Golden Dome is funded partly through borrowing, The cost is not only the missile shield, it is the shield plus the interest path created by financing it. This is how Golden Dome could affect households without appearing directly on a household bill. Reuters reported that the U.S. Space Force awarded contracts worth up to $3.2 billion to 12 companies to develop space-based missile defense interceptor systems for Trump's Golden Dome plan. That is not the full trillion. It is the opening gate. Early contracts fund designs, prototypes, engineering, and industrial capacity. Future production contracts could then be worth $1.8 billion to $3.4 billion annually. This is how policy turns into cash flow. A Trump executive order becomes Pentagon architecture. That architecture becomes Space Force contracts. Those contracts become revenue, supplier orders, payroll, factories, engineers, and district jobs. Golden Dome becomes more than a security idea. It becomes an economic constituency. That is not automatically corruption, it is incentives. Contractors want long-duration revenue. Military planners want capability. Politicians want jobs and protection. Budget officials want costs spread across years. Taxpayers rarely see the full chain on one clean receipt. And then another force appears, the sunk cost fallacy. Once tens of billions have been spent on prototypes, factories, software, workers, and jobs across states, cancellation becomes harder. Not because the next dollar is always wise, because the last dollar already created commitments. That is how large defense projects become easier to start than to stop. Now comes the second financial twist. The most expensive systems are not always expensive because of purchase price. They are expensive because of the life cycle. CBO's Golden Dome-style estimate includes development, deployment, and operation. Space systems do not sit quietly forever. Satellites must be launched, networks managed, hardware replaced, software upgraded, sensors integrated, and personnel paid. And threats do not freeze while the budget is being written. A cheaper version may be possible, but a cheaper version may not deliver the same capability. CBO said removing the space-based interceptor layer would cut the cost to about $448 billion. But that version would no longer match President Trump's order calling for space-based interceptors. That is the real trade-off. The more complete Trump's Golden Dome becomes, the larger the bill. The smaller the bill, the more limited the shield. So the budget debate is not simply Golden Dome or no Golden Dome. It is which shield, against which threats, with which technology, over which timeline, and paid for by whom. This is where slogans break. National security wants maximum protection. Budgets demand limits, and debt charges interest while the argument continues. CBO projects federal outlays of $7.4 trillion in 2026 and revenues of $5.6 trillion. That gap becomes Treasury debt, and Treasury debt must be serviced. By 2036, interest would account for nearly 1/5 of federal spending. That is the quiet budget item, and it is why the tax question cannot be avoided. That does not mean taxes must rise tomorrow. It means the tax base becomes one of the future shock absorbers. If spending commitments keep rising and revenue does not keep up, the eventual adjustment has to come from somewhere. Higher taxes are one route. Lower spending somewhere else is another. More borrowing is the third. But more borrowing usually means more interest later. So the public does pay, just not always immediately or visibly. People debate the visible program. They rarely debate the financing chain, but that chain is where the household impact hides. A worker may never think about space-based interceptors, but that worker pays income tax and lives inside future budgets where interest may already have claimed more room. That is the connection. Not direct, but real. Trump's Golden Dome is not just a missile defense question. It is a question about adding another long-term obligation while the U.S. balance sheet is already stretched. The finance lesson is sharper. Every promise has a funding mechanism. Every funding mechanism has a payer, and that payer may be hidden behind time. That is why who pays is the only honest question. Not because defense is unimportant, because importance does not remove cost. So, who pays for Trump's Golden Dome? Defense contractors get paid first. The Pentagon allocates, Congress appropriates, Treasury finances, bond markets absorb, taxpayer service, and future budgets adjust. And the final payer may not be the person named in the announcement. The final payer may be the person living inside the budget it created. If this money mechanism still leaves a question in your mind, drop it below. The best one may become the next Money Explained breakdown. The Golden Dome debate is not really about whether a trillion-dollar shield sounds powerful. It is about what happens when a country tries to buy protection with money it may have to borrow. Because President Trump's shield may be designed for space. But the bill lands on Earth.